Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Braden Knutson. I'll be your host for this webinar. I'd like to welcome everyone here today. If you wouldn't mind answering a couple of our polls down here at the bottom, tell us where you're listening from and how you heard about today's webinar. We'd really appreciate that. Help us to improve some of our analytics and whatnot. I've got a couple of announcements here. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, this Thursday, February 2nd at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and that will be by James Tanner again. He'll be returning for us again, which will be pretty good. And also, the beginning of February, we have Roots Tech, if you haven't heard about it yet, but I'm sure most people have by this point. If you haven't yet registered to attend that event and you're planning on it, you can go to our main webpage, and there's a link to the registration there. Also, at the end of this month, there is a family tree question and answer session with Catherine Grant, and that will be on February 24th. And if there is a link to submit questions ahead of time attached to the February webinar schedule, so we'd really appreciate if you could submit some questions, let us know, and that'll be a great experience. We can do a question and answer session. So today we'll be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Making the Most of Compiled Sources, Directories, Biographies, Surname Books, and More. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years' experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. Okay, so we'll get the time over to James now, and as this is loading, let everybody box and a questions box to the right. If you have any questions, we'll make sure those are answered by the end of the presentation.
Howdy, this is James Tanner, and we're here today at the BYU Family History Library with a webinar entitled Making the Most of Compiled Sources, Directories, Biographies, Surname Books, and More. I'd like to remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel on youtube.com. You can go there by searching for BYU Family History Library. This is an interesting topic here for genealogists because many of these compiled sources are, I don't know how to say this quite diplomatically, but they're sort of looked down on by a lot of genealogists, mainly for the reason that they seem to lack sources as such. They don't usually tell where the information came from. And so they require a little bit more evaluation than other kinds of sources. And when we're talking about a source, we're talking about a place where information was stored, historically stored, about our ancestral families. So if we find a birth certificate, that becomes a record, and the source, of course, is wherever that record was kept and compiled. Unfortunately, the term source is used in both cases to indicate the document or the record, and also to indicate the place where the document and the record was either stored or created. So there's a little bit of confusion using that word, but basically we need to address at this point what is meant by a compiled source. And compiling, of course, means that it's added together from other location sources, and we look at this. So first of all, they're a book or other document that has been created by using original records and becomes what is called a secondary source, reflecting the opinion and research decisions of the compiler. So if I get a whole bunch of records together about historical figures or my ancestors, and then I take that information and create a secondary list of it, an index or a commentary or history or a biography or any of the things that different categories of books and other kinds of publications that could be created, then those become secondary. In other words, I'm using creating a document that involves my manipulation of the original documents and is not simply a copy of the original documents. So sometimes we have difficulty in distinguishing between those. Many people look at online indexes, for example, a birth index. The one that comes to mind immediately is the California Birth Index, and it's a substantially large listing of people born in California, although that is not the original source. In other words, the documents were created, whatever kind of birth records were created during the time periods when those kinds of records were created in California. And then sometime later, all of those documents were compiled or put together into an index. Somebody put them, extracted certain parts of the information, usually the name and the date of birth and the place of birth, and left the rest of the information that may have been contained in the original documents out of the index, and the index then becomes like a table of contents or the index to a book. That's not the complete amount of information that is available. So we have to understand that a compiled source may or may not be reliable. It may be very reliable. An index can be very extensive and very well done and very exhaustive and be a marvelous finding document where we can find other more information. But on the other hand, they can be completely unreliable. Many of the early surname books, when we're talking early, we're talking books written a couple of hundred years ago or more, are in many cases, in some cases they're very reliable, but in many cases they are simply repetitions of even fables and myths and things that were passed down traditionally and have no basis in fact. So we need to look carefully at any of these compiled sources because they are not necessarily the original document. And the better practice here would be for a genealogical researcher to take the time to verify that the information contained in the index or in the compiled source actually came from records that were reliable in the first instance. So the next question comes up is, how do I tell if a source has been compiled? Oh, well, how do we know if this is original or whether it's something that was somebody's interpretation of what the original may have been, or even made up and not even based on any kind of an original document. I'm thinking in this case of a book that was written about my great-great-great-grandfather who lived in a little town in southern Utah called St. George, Utah, now quite a large city, kind of a destination for retirement and a lot of types of recreation. But at that time, it was a small settlement, and a book was written by one of his descendants about his life. There are no citations in that book telling us where any of that information came from. There are conversations recorded. There are incidents and descriptions and all sorts of things in the book. It's really a novel written about the ancestor. You would think you would put it in the category of a biographical novel. But unfortunately, for many of the members of the family, they choose to take that book as being the explanation, the reality of what happened to this particular ancestor. So what we have to do is understand the difference between basic historical investigations or research where we're looking at documents that were created at or near the time of an event by someone who actually observed the event, and those types of records that are extracted or compiled from those earlier records that have been made. So in this case, we look at it and we say, we ask a question. We say, is the source a document that was created at or near the time of an event in an ancestor's life by someone who witnessed the event or had a duty or obligation to record the event? And that's the basis of the division between a original, what we refer to often as an original or first-hand source document, and a later or compiled source. Now the next one is, how do I evaluate the reliability of a compiled source? How do I know whether it's reliable or not? Well, in the case of my ancestral novel, it becomes pretty obvious that some of the things in the book are not necessarily true. For instance, this particular ancestor's name was George Jarvis. His wife's name was Anne Pryor, or Anne Pryor Jarvis, after they got married. They were from England. And Anne Pryor is mentioned in the book as being a possible illegitimate daughter of the King of England. Unfortunately, that was absolutely not possible, A, and B, she has only a sort of passing she had the same kind of rotund figure, let's just put it that way, as Queen Victoria. And so from that reason, there was some speculation on her maybe relationship to the kings in England. But this is the kind of thing that is just totally fabricated. There is just no basis. In fact, we have a very, very well documented pedigree back many generations from Anne Pryor in England. So it's not even a question of whether or not she had any relationship to royalty. But those are the kinds of things, unfortunately, that become kind of ingrained into compiled sources, because they do have that kind of thing. I have another compiled source, what's called a surname book, a book written about an individual, one individual with a particular surname and their descendants, or an individual and their ancestors, or simply about people with a specific surname in an area of the world. Those are kind of all fall into the category of what we call generally surname books. And this surname book starts out with a very well-known genealogical myth about three brothers who left England, who had the name of the original family and came to America. The Three Brothers myth is one of the most persistent and most easily debunked myths of genealogical research. So we can start to compile, to evaluate the source by looking at this. Are there cited sources for all the names, dates, and places? In other words, are they telling you from this compiled source where they got the information? This is particularly hard in an index, because the index may say this is an index of all the birth records in a particular location, like index to the birth records that I mentioned in California or wherever, but they never tell you which of the records, or where they got the records, or how they were preserved, or which ones they looked at. So the more detail there is about the origin of the information in the particular document, in the particular publication, the compiled source, and gives you the better understanding of how reliable it may be. The point here being that if a source is provided, then you can go back and look at the original source to verify that the person copied the information correctly, or that they included all the information that was in the original source. So the second part of that is, are there copies of documents and records from the original sources? So if you're looking at, for example, a family tree, online family tree, and you find that none of the information that's provided in that online family tree has any attached sources or footnotes, or whatever you want to call them, to actual documents that can be verified, then that information has to be considered to be unreliable. You can't simply rely on the fact that somebody just put that information into the program. So you might say something like this: well, what about information that's given firsthand? What if I put in my parents or my whatever, my grandparents that I knew personally, and I put their information into a family tree, and I say uh, personal sources or personal information or my firsthand information. Well, in reality, that may be the only place that this particular information is available. But on the other hand, you still haven't shown us that the information you're providing is reliable, that we can go back and look to a source. What we're limited on doing is talking to you personally. Well, what if you're dead? Well, you can't talk to you, so obviously we can't figure out if the information is correct. And then there's the secondary part of that where they say, well, what if there is no other information? What if all I have is a letter from Aunt Sue telling us that these children were all born on these dates, and that's the only record we happen to have of that? The answer is that's the only record, but we're going to cite that record and, if possible, provide a copy of the letter so that whoever reads it can make an evaluation as to whether or not the information is correct or not. And we will then go try and find additional information that may either corroborate the information in the letter or show that it's not correct. This is just part of the whole process of doing historical research. Another one is the author compiler writing from personal knowledge, and this is what I've been talking about. We have a tendency to think that anything that's attributed to personal knowledge has then becomes a primary source and is just absolutely, because of that reason, reliable. And the answer is not always. That is not always the case. Um, Probably the classic example is people trying to remember their own birth date. It is not necessarily a good idea to rely on people's representation of their age or their birth date. In fact, if you're going into census records, for example, the dates are almost always wrong. They're at least off very frequently by a year. But even if they aren't off by a year, there's many times when people simply lie about their age for all sorts of reasons. Um, we've had numerous examples of that where an age was given by someone in order to get married, and they weren't of age, they weren't of age of majority, and normally they would have required their parents' permission to get married at that particular time, and then they go in and say, no, I'm 18 or 21 or whatever the date was at the time that had to do. Other one is people, many times people who joined the army um, or armies of the world in various countries lied about their age, either to get out of the army or to get into the army, one or the other. So there was, there's kind of a both way there. There's all sorts of these instances where people are unreliable. Now, the question here that we're really dealing with is whether we're going to rely on fact or whether we're going to start relying on fiction. This past week or so, I have been dealing with a long series of issues with doing research in Wales. And the person I'm helping has a very long history of family traditions about their Welsh ancestors. And some years ago, and it appears to be about almost 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, the family hired a professional genealogist in England to do some research on the family. And they produced two documents. The researcher, the hired researcher in England, produced two documents outlining what he had found in various records in Wales and what his conclusions were concerning the family. Well, at the time, that particular document, the two letters that came from this researcher in England were basically rejected by the family because they disagreed with their personal traditional story that they had received from their ancestors. And they refused to hire the guy any further and didn't follow up on it, and just said that he'd been making all this stuff up and they didn't believe it. And so they weren't even going to pay him, but I don't know whether they paid him or not. But anyway, so Now we're 20 years later, 15, 20 years later after the fact, and we're going back and looking at the same letters that were written by this genealogist. And I've spent with my friend who I'm helping do this. I spent the last couple of weeks going through documents and sitting here going through microfilm records and other things. And guess what? We have verified almost every last word that the researcher had to say. And of course, everything that the tradition in the family was has now been proved to be wrong, and so we're completely off in the direction that they should have been going 20 years ago instead of today. So this issue of whether things are fact or made up or fiction, being the traditions versus documents, is really a problem with genealogical research, because many people come in with preconceived notions about their families, and they're sort of in the status of those people that say, I know what I believe. Don't confuse me with the facts. Don't let me know what really happened here. I want to believe what I want to believe. Now, this important thing, we're going to change a little bit of a direction here, because not all compiled sources are automatically bad. We're not trying to condemn these sources, because they're extremely useful in a lot of cases. You just have to treat them in a separate category than you would if you had other types of documents. Now, here's some of the types of documents that we're talking about. Directories. Now, most of us today have thrown away our paper telephone directories, or that they're gathering dust in the closet or someplace, and we look up everything online, or we have some kind of we have everybody on their phone or whatever. So directories have a long history. They go back hundreds of years, perhaps as far back as 1,000 years. People have been compiling directories of all sorts of different things in different cities and different localities. And they are an extremely valuable source of information, and have been the key to specifically identifying a lot of people for my patrons that I've dealt with over the years. Biographies are extremely valuable. Once again, you have to go in and try and separate the fact from the fiction. At one time, a few years ago, we had a tradition in our family that was passed down through one of our family lines, the Morgan family line, that we were related to Daniel Boone, the American frontiersman from the early days of our country. And it took me about 15 minutes of genealogical research to discover that we had absolute no connection with Daniel Boone. The only place that came from was because Daniel Boone's mother was a Morgan. And so the people automatically assumed we were related. Well, Morgan is one of the most common surnames in Wales that exists. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who in Wales today who are Morgans, and most of them are not related to each other, unless there's some prehistoric Morgan back there that was the first one. But it really is a name that had various points of origin. Surname books. Well, what about the biographies book is that I've carrying Daniel Boone forward. Daniel Boone had a whole bunch of different stories about his life. And in digging into this, one of my interests was just to go back and read all the biographies of Daniel Boone. It was interesting. Some of them were very factual and very detailed, and cited a lot of original documents, and some of them were just pure fiction. They were just made-up stories that went along with Daniel Boone a lot. And they even have television shows about Daniel Boone. Of course, most of that obviously is not kind of thing you would want to put in your family history. I think the one that topped out on Daniel Boone was there was a historical society for one of the counties in Kentucky who claimed that Daniel Boone was one of the original inhabitants of their county and and that was their claim to fame in that particular county in Kentucky. A little bit of research showed that Daniel Boone never went anywhere close to that county in his lifetime. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Surname books, I mentioned those. Those are books that are compiled about an individual's ancestors or descendants, or simply about a particular surname and all the people who are related in that surname. Indexes are included in this category of compiled sources. Now, none of these are automatically bad. They can be very good and very helpful. And then lists. There are just simply lists of people, not in any sense a directory of trying to find the individuals for some reason, but they just simply list all the people. The classic lists for us here in Utah are there's a website that was created called the Overland Trails website, and the Overland Trails website lists all the people who were in the different pioneer companies who crossed the plains between 1847 and about 1867, 1868. So these are the list kinds of things that we look at. If we use any of these sources, the important thing to do when we're doing our own research is to list them all. We need to list as a source. If we looked at an index, we need to list it, that is one of the places we looked and got information. If we looked at a surname book, we need to list the surname book. It doesn't matter whether or not the surname book turned out to be reliable or not, but we need to know that that's one of the places where we could potentially find information about that particular ancestor. So all those sources, whether they're compiled or original, need to be listed when we're doing our particular research. Okay, so here's a question for you to think about for a second. Is an obituary an original or a compiled source? Now, I would venture to say that among the vast majority of genealogical researchers, an obituary would be considered to be a valuable original source, when in fact it is a compiled source. There's nothing in an obituary that refers to or particularly tells us where the information came from. We have no idea who these people were, who wrote it, or or where they got their information, or whether they even knew anything about this person. You have to recognize the fact that some obituaries are written by the newspaper employees who have never met the person and haven't talked to anybody about them. They just went out and found some information about the person and wrote an obituary. That's particularly true if the person was a prominent member of the community. They would just simply put down there whatever they thought was appropriate to say about this particular person, rather than try to get into any very much specifics. They are valuable. That's not diminish the value of obituaries as a source of a place where we can go to get information, but they are, whether you like it or not, they're still a compiled source. They come from other sources that are not particularly revealed at any time. This particular news clipping here that I've got, it's obviously on the screen, you can't see the details there, but that whole page there is obituaries. That is a list of that particular newspaper list. There is just one long list of people who died during the year. It's other kinds of events. It calls events of the year, but all through that listed are the prominent people who died in that particular community. And this one came from, I don't even know which state journal it came from, but I found that turned out to be all obituary type information. So then we can ask even the larger question, then, is a newspaper an original or a compiled source? The answer to this is fairly simple. If you have ever had a news article written about anything that you personally were familiar with. So if you were in an accident and then you read the newspaper accounts of the accident, you might wonder if you were actually in the accident, if it was you they were writing about. And this is something that we have to understand when we're doing historical research, is that even though newspapers are extremely valuable sources, they are basically compiled because they don't usually tell you where they got the information. And what's really interesting about newscasts, newspaper articles, now almost all online, and this goes for anything you see on Facebook or any other social networking site or even the online news sources, is they often interview somebody about a subject of which you know this person that they've just interviewed has absolutely no knowledge. They don't know anything about it. They'll just say, okay, well, this guy was standing here when the robbery occurred. So what did you see? I mean, that doesn't tell you anything at all. That just tells you the guy was, what if the guy was blind, deaf, and couldn't, couldn't see anything? But this is really the problem. And sometimes the more you know about the subject, the less you're impressed by the news coverage. Um, so basically the point here and the rule is that all sources, whether they're we call original or whether we're calling them compiled or whether secondary or whatever we want to call them, all sources need to be evaluated, and they need to be evaluated on their own merit. In other words, are they reliable? Were they done? Who was the person who compiled, who created the source? Was that person reliable? Was the information reliable? We often find, for example, um, death certificates that have information about parts of the death certificate are talking about the person's birth and parents. Well, there's nothing about the person when they died, unless they were a child, for example, or very young, that probably their parents and their birthplace and all that information is not readily available to the person who's filling out the birth certificate. So it's not necessarily very reliable. And yet we'll just dutifully copy that information into our family group sheets, into our uh, pedigrees and our online, and put down birth certificate. And boy, we've nailed that guy's identity because now we have the birth certificate. But on the other hand, if we don't evaluate that information essentially line by line and say, well, who could have supplied this information and is it reliable, then we may be a little bit more than a little bit off base and misled by what we're looking at. So we have some traditional source evaluation criteria. Those are things we talk about: original versus derivative. Is it a copy or is it original of a document? This can become a problem because, for example, in the early part of the United States history, many of the original documents were copied into the court records. So if you're going to look at a court record and you see a will in the court, that wasn't the will that was written by the individual in a lot of cases. It is a copy of the will written by the court clerk or someone who had the responsibility of copying that particular document, that will, into the court record. And so the question, of course, is that an original will or is that a derivative will? It's an original court record, but is it an original will? And the answer may be dependent on whether or not that was the actual document signed by the deceased or if it was just a copy that was copied into the record. Ideally, you'd like to see the original document signed by the deceased. You may not ever see that document. That may never longer be available. What you may have to rely on the derivative document or the copy. Now today we also talk about primary or secondary, and a primary document being one that was created at or near the time, etc., or the secondary document is something that was created as a result of looking at primary documents or remembering primary documents or things like that. So you can go through. And we talk about direct or indirect. A direct document being a document that was directly involved with a person who was directly involved with an event. An indirect would be someone who heard about it. In court, we'd call this hearsay. That would be someone who had heard someone else say something and then was reporting what was said, and we always classify that as being less reliable. Now let's look at these individual types of records out there. The surname book. This is an example of a surname book, the genealogy of Thomas Tanner Sr. And this one goes back, and this This one is clear back in the 1800s, and it's a memorial by Reverend Elias F. Tanner, A.B. And by the way, I'm not related to these people at all. As far as we can determine, we are not related to this Thomas Tanner person in Cornwall, Connecticut, because he was, Tanner is another one of those really common names in England and other places. In fact, there are Tanners from Switzerland. And we've never found any connection between a lot of them, because Tanner is a occupational surname, comes from an occupation, and it arose independently in lots of different places in England among people who were not necessarily related, unless you believe, of course, and in the extractions that come from current DNA, that everyone in England was related to the same 6 people originally. But of course, you can go back and say we're all related for the same person, and that we call that back to Adam, and that's another problem altogether we won't talk about today. But this is your surname book. The question here is, how reliable is it? Now, here's the point on the surname books, because not all surname books are bad. Just because they're a surname book or because they're a compilation, we have to understand that some of these books were written many years ago when the people described were alive and knew about their ancestors. So if you have a book, for instance, if I have a book on the Tanners that goes back into the 1800s, I'm back, in some cases, they're talking to people who were alive, who are now my 3rd and 4th and 5th generation great-grandparents. And so I can find, in essence, a window into what those people thought. Now, the information provided may not be totally reliable, but it's more information in a lot of cases than you would have had otherwise. And to ignore these books is not a very good idea. You really need to go through. I have some very large compilation surname books. In one family line, I have a 700-page surname book that has a tremendous amount of information, a lot of stories about the families, and not one source citation. So I have no idea where the information came from. This is very interesting. And in addition, you'll find that some of these books have complete and exhaustive source citations. I have picked up one of these books that looked like the person just simply dumped all their research into the book, which they do in some cases, and it told every piece of paper and document that was used to support every single conclusion in the book. So you can't just assume because it's a surname book and a published genealogy that it is somehow bad. Now the question that comes up sometimes is, now is the surname book itself a source? And the answer is yes, it is. If you get information out of that, a story or a picture of a document or a picture of whatever, then you need to list that. You need to tell the rest of us where you got that information and include it that you got it out of the surname book. I mean, it's not bad. It's just it's bad if you don't tell us, because then we have no way of knowing and verifying what it is where you got this particular story or this particular document that may not be available now elsewhere. Okay, so where do you find surname books? Well, everywhere. There's a huge collection on FamilySearch.org in their books section. They're now up to about 236,000 books scanned, I think. No, 326,000, got my numbers reversed. 326,000 books in FamilySearch.org. Whatever the number is, there's a huge number. And Google Books, you can find them by looking for your surname. Looking for the names of your ancestors, doing a Google search, and find out somebody's written a book. A lot of people say to me, well, who would write a book about my ancestors weren't famous? Why would they write a book about them? The answer is they did. You'd be surprised. Many people are surprised to find out that there's actually a book about their ancestors. So it's time to go looking. WorldCat.org is a catalog of of a huge number of catalogs of libraries around the world, And by doing a search again for your ancestors' names or your surnames, you'll find, you may very well find surname books in WorldCat. Archive.org, as the Internet Archive, has a huge number of online books, and a lot of those include books that fall into the category of surname books about specific families. The other large online source is the Hathi Trust. The Hathi Trust, about, well, a fairly high percentage of the items are in public domain. The rest of them are only available through universities, but this is another huge online collection of digitized material where you can actually see the books and download them in some cases. Okay, let's move on to directories. This is a directory created in 1866 and it's sort of an address book for people in this particular town in Germany. And basically, directories date back hundreds of years. Here's one of the oldest printed lists of the merchants of London, and this one was reprinted in 1863, but it dates back to 1677. And so there are directories going back a lot, many, many years. From a genealogical standpoint, they may not give you a lot of information, but they may be able to identify a specific ancestor in a specific location, which always is helpful, particularly if you've been trying to find somebody back in that time period. When you get back to 1677, there's still some ability to find people in England by parish registers and other documents like probate records and things like that. If you do a search online for directories, you'll find out that FamilySearch.org has a number of directories, as does Ancestry.com and Archive.org. All of these have online, freely readable copies of the directories. But there's also a website called City Directories of the United States of America on uscitydirectories.com that lists a rather extensive number of directories that were compiled for various cities around the United States. In a lot of cases, however, you're going to find that these directories have not been completely digitized and available online. You may, in fact, find copies of the directories in state archives, state libraries, county libraries, even public libraries may have a collection of old directories. And so you may have to do some additional searching beyond simply looking them up online. Primarily look first for directories in libraries and archives. You don't necessarily need to go to the library or the archive. You can look in their catalog and see if there's a directory. Now, the good news is that they'd have a lot of directories, and the bad news is that they may not be cataloged under the word directory. They may have some other title that does not involve the word directory, so you may have to do a little bit of additional thinking and searching and asking. And it doesn't hurt to go to the libraries and talk to the librarian or the reference librarian about the location of some of these books, because they may very well have them. One thing about most of the directories, they're like phone directories and things like that. They're not necessarily small volumes. They could be very large volumes. A lot of the directories that were called city directories previously contained extensive amounts of advertising, and so those directories are sometimes quite large and very heavy and thick. So the basic idea here for directories is look wherever there are books and other records. Any place there's a book or other record, any website that has books could have a copy of a directory, because directories are generally considered to be books and they can show up anywhere. Now we're going to talk about biographies. In this case, I have put up a copy of my great-grandfather's biography, Henry Martin Tanner, Joseph City, Arizona pioneer, and it has his birth date and his death date, and all that, by the way, is the title to this particular biography, that whole set there. And it was written back in 1964, extensively supported by documents, but unfortunately those documents are included by description only in the text. So most of the information in this particular biography is compiled firsthand, because the person who wrote the book is Henry Martin Tanner's son. So George S. Tanner is one of the sons of Henry Martin Tanner, who, by the way, had 17 children. So George was one of 17 children. And one of the things that you have to remember when you read a biography is that this is, to a large extent, there may be some parts of it that are, let's call it reconstructed history, where, or what we would generally refer to as just outright fiction. So there's a lot of times the authors will put in personal observations or their impressions or what they thought the person might have said or what they might have done under certain circumstances. And so you just have to be careful about extracting any information. However, this particular book is a very good source of stories about Henry Martin Tanner. And whether they're all strictly true or not, they're simply stories, and they're entertaining and they're interesting, and they add a considerable amount to the bare genealogy of names, dates, and places. Now we go to the other end of the spectrum, is what I mentioned earlier, are the fictionalizations. And this one is called Lincoln, and it's a novel by Gore Vidal. Now you would not expect, except for the barest minimum of reference to Abraham Lincoln, that this book would be factually correct. There's no reason why he would have included any factual information. Now, when there are historical novellists who are trying to write accurately with historical novels, there's sometimes they're commented, they are made said that they are reliable, or that this is an accurate depiction and all that. Well, basically those kinds of evaluations are based on the reviewer. Whoever it is that's telling you that this is an accurate depiction is the one that's telling you that may or may not have that information correct. And the interesting thing about a biography is it can lead you to other sources. If it's a good biography, I mean one that's well documented in the sense that the person used actual sources in writing the biography, then it can certainly lead you to the original sources about that particular person. Okay, now we're going to move on to indexes, and indexes are only as accurate as the indexers. It's hard to say that. It's really hard to get into this subject without mentioning the indexes that exist in the search engines that are being used by the large online genealogy database programs. And when I talk about the large programs, I'm talking about Ancestry and Find My Past and Family Search and MyHeritage and some of the other websites, GeneaNet and others that have huge compilations. So when we look at an index, the first thought we have is that it's a finding aid, of course, but the answer is it include our ancestor? Well, most of us who have been doing genealogy for any considerable period of time realize that the indexing is not always accurate. One of the most common ways that we discover this as we begin our research is trying to find an ancestor who we knew existed in in a number of census years. In the United States, federal census was taken every 10 years, beginning in 1790 through the current census today, which was taken in the year, 2000. And so we have every 10-year census, I guess 2010. And so we have, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, like 1800, I mean, 1810, 1820, 1830, 1840, etc. So every 10 years. Um, and there are indexes for those census records. And as I discovered early in my genealogical experience, those indexes are not always accurate. And so that is we cannot assume that simply because we do not find the person in an index that the person's name is not in that particular record someplace. So sometimes that requires us to go back and start looking through the record page by page and line by line to make sure that the person was not overlooked. So we have to understand also that indexes are finding aids that are copies from the original sources, and that you should always check the original record when it's available. The primary reason for this is also very simple, and that is the indexes almost never contain all of the information in the original source. So if you want to know what really happened, you have to go back and look at the document rather than rely on an index of any kind. If the index is the only record available, then you're stuck. Obviously, there's no way of going back to the original document, but that isn't necessarily always the case. And always search by every kind of different word and spelling that you can imagine, and some maybe you can't imagine, because that may be the way that it was indexed. And I guess my comment here is never fully trust an index. If somebody says, well, I can't find it, and I go, well, have you looked line by line through the census records? And they go, you don't really think I'm going to do that, do you? And I go, well, no, but if you want to find the person, that's what you're basically going to have to do, just like the rest of us have done. And then we're down to lists. Now, lists are the problem you have with lists is you have to watch for typographical errors. One of the most common ones is transpositions. If people are listing all of the people who were in a town at a particular time, or as I mentioned earlier in the Overland Trails lists and those kinds of things, the record is only as accurate as the original compilation. And I have been on lists, school lists, and all sorts of things. When I was, I can think back, one of the most common problems I have with the name Tanner is that people automatically, without even thinking, think my name is Turner. And so I say Tanner, and they say, "Oh, Mr. Turner, how are you?" And depending on who I'm talking to and whether I care or not, I either let it go or whatever. So you have to kind of watch that, because on lists it can be, and watch for names that are out of order or misspelled. We think that there is only one way of spelling names. By the way, that is one of the other myths of genealogy that needs to be dispelled. And look carefully at the context, because we never know. We need to know the context in which this list was created as to who was included and who wasn't. There may be a reason why some people are not included in the list of participants. So here's, for example, this is an example. This is Germany Bremen passenger departure list. This is people who came to America from Germany between 1904 and 1914. And they have no images available. And they refer you to a GS film number. And it would be helpful if you could go back and look at this, but then you would have to look at the Genealogical Society film number. This one would be from FamilySearch.org, and that would get you into the original. But don't be surprised if the original document only has exactly what's in the list. They may have corrected it all. But never assume that an index or list is complete. They're just not possible. and this is once again repeating this because it's so important, to always search the original record if it's at all possible. And then keep searching. Here we have the proverbial needle in the haystack. It's not really a needle, it's more like a long pin, but it might be more difficult to find. What we find out today is that, and there was a book of poetry that was written many years ago that the title of the book comes from a poem, and its poem is "Some haystacks don't even have needles." And so we need to remember that sometimes when we're looking for a needle in a haystack, it may not be there at all. Okay, well, thank you so much for watching today, and we appreciate you tuning in to our webinars. Remember that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. We'd ask you to get notice and us to get notice too. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James, for the wonderful webinar. It's been very informative, and hopefully you were able to learn a lot as we went through this. If you missed anything, this webinar will be posted later on this week, so you can come back and rewatch it. If you didn't get a chance to answer some of our polls down here at the bottom at the beginning of the webinar, feel free to do so now. Also, if you have any questions, please write those in so we can get those answered for you and clarify anything that was confusing. And also, we'd love to have some more of your feedback. Let us know how we're doing and what we can do to improve our webinars. Um, and then I think that's all, and we would love to see you next time. Thanks.